The soft hum of conversation filled the air as the guests mingled under the delicate chandeliers in the grand reception hall. White roses adorned every table, their scent mixing with the light fragrance of champagne and the warmth of the evening. Laughter echoed from every corner, and yet for Laura, the sound felt like it belonged to another world. She stood near the edge of the room, watching as her cousin Sarah laughed with her new husband, James, who seemed to glow with happiness. It was supposed to be a joyous occasion, a moment of celebration, but for Laura, the weight of the evening felt suffocating. Her father, Bob, was making his way to the head table, beaming with pride as he exchanged words with their relatives. Laura could hear the familiar echo of his voice over the din of the reception. She braced herself, knowing the inevitable moment was coming, when her father would make his infamous toast. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bob called out, raising his glass, the smile on his face wide but slightly forced. "I want to take a moment to toast the happy couple, Sarah and James. A fine pair, a real example of dedication to family, honor, and service to our country." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, before his gaze shifted across the room, landing on Laura. The spotlight shifted, and suddenly, all eyes were on her. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, a mix of discomfort and anxiety. Her father's gaze, though warm and proud, was always tinged with the weight of unsaid things. "And now," he continued, his voice carrying through the room, "some of you might be wondering about my daughter Laura over there." He gestured in her direction with a raised glass, the crowd's attention following his hand. "She likes to tell people she's in the Navy too." A ripple of uncomfortable chuckles spread through the room. Laura forced a smile, her stomach sinking. The laughter felt more like a slap than a joke. Sarah, radiant in her wedding dress, turned toward Laura, offering an apologetic look, but she didn't fully understand. She didn't know the weight of the years of disappointment, the constant struggle to prove herself worthy. "But the truth is," Bob continued, his voice tinged with a certain finality that Laura had heard countless times before, "Laura works at some desk job on a Navy base. Probably filing paperwork or something. Nothing like what James does. Real military service." Another wave of awkward laughter rippled through the guests. Laura's chest tightened. She could feel the sting of his words, the years of silent rejection in that single sentence. She had worked harder than anyone knew to earn her place in the Navy, but to her father it would never be enough. Aunt Carol, always eager to add her 2 cents, leaned in and whispered loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Didn't she drop out of the Naval Academy?" "That's right," Bob nodded solemnly, his voice dripping with disappointment. "Couldn't handle the pressure. We had such high hopes when she got that appointment, but some people just aren't cut out for military life." Laura sat frozen, her hands gripping the edge of her chair as her father continued to diminish everything she had worked for. She didn't know whether to scream or to cry, but instead she remained still, her face a mask of composed detachment. Across the room, James shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had been watching the exchange with an uncertain expression, his eyes flicking toward Laura, but she couldn't read what he was thinking. Perhaps he had no idea of the depths of her father's judgment. "Anyway," Bob raised his glass once more, his tone lightening, "at least she found steady employment somewhere, even if it's not what we hoped for. To James and Sarah, may your marriage be blessed with the kind of honor and dedication that real naval service requires." The crowd echoed the toast, raising their glasses. But Laura remained motionless, her smile frozen in place, her heart sinking deeper into the pit of her stomach. Her father's words rang in her ears, each one a reminder of how little he had ever believed in her. The evening wore on, and though the reception was filled with laughter and celebration, Laura couldn't shake the feeling of isolation that hung around her. Her father's words had dug deep into her soul, as they always did. This time, however, the sting was sharper. It wasn't just the old familiar hurt. It was the shame of being publicly dismissed by the man who had raised her, who was supposed to be proud of her accomplishments. She excused herself from the table, retreating to a quiet corner near the bar. Her hands shook slightly as she picked up a glass of water, trying to steady herself. She couldn't leave yet. She couldn't abandon Sarah on her wedding day, no matter how badly she wanted to escape. But the night had turned sour, and the weight of it was becoming unbearable. It wasn't just the words. It was the years of living in her father's shadow, of working tirelessly to prove herself, and still never being enough. As she stood in the quiet corner, lost in her thoughts, a familiar voice broke through her reverie. "Ma'am." She turned to find James standing in front of her. His tuxedo slightly rumpled from the dancing and laughter earlier in the evening. He looked slightly uncomfortable, unsure of how to proceed. "Could I speak with you privately?" he asked, his tone soft but urgent. Laura hesitated, wondering what he wanted. They had only just met that day, and though she had noticed him at the wedding, they hadn't exchanged many words. Still, there was something in his demeanor that made her feel like he wasn't part of the game her family had always played. "Of course," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. She followed him to a quiet corner near the bar, the soft hum of conversation muffling their footsteps. James ran a hand through his hair, his nervousness clear. "Commander," he started, but then quickly corrected himself. "I'm sorry. I don't know how you prefer to be addressed when you're not in uniform." Laura blinked, taken aback by his formality. "Excuse me." He seemed to realize the awkwardness and paused. I didn't know how to address you. I should have just said Laura. But you're..." She raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean? You're Commander Laura Morgan, aren't you? Commanding officer of USS Hartford." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Her heart skipped a beat, and for the first time that evening, she felt something other than pain or frustration. This wasn't just a man who was vaguely aware of her. This was someone who knew her rank, her service, the respect she had earned. She hadn't heard those words in years. "How do you know that?" she asked, trying to steady her voice. James seemed surprised by the question. "Ma'am, you don't know who I am, do you?" His face softened as he realized the gap in their mutual understanding. "I'm your cousin's new husband, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell. But I'm also the engineering officer on USS New Hampshire. We've been working joint operations with Hartford for the past 8 months. I've been in briefings with you." For a moment, Laura could only stare at him, struggling to reconcile the image of the man in front of her with the officer she had known professionally. He looked young, his tuxedo stark against his usually uniformed figure. His hair tousled in a way that seemed oddly unfamiliar. "Mitchell," she said, her voice tinged with realization. "James Mitchell." "Yes, ma'am," he confirmed. "You usually go by Jim in the wardroom." Her mind reeled. She had been so focused on the chaos of the evening that she hadn't recognized him, but now it all made sense. This was the same Jim she'd worked alongside during various naval operations. But why was he here, speaking to her like this, in the middle of a family wedding? As they continued their conversation, James revealed that he had known about her service for months. He spoke of her leadership, her dedication, and the respect she commanded from the crew. He had assumed that her family knew as well. But when he found out they didn't, something in him had snapped. He couldn't just stand by and let the misconceptions continue. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I don't understand. Your father just told 200 people that you're essentially a clerk. How do they not know what you do?" Laura's heart pounded. She didn't know how to answer. How could she explain to him the years of silence, of never being seen for who she truly was? How could she explain that to her family, her father? It would never be enough. "Because I've never told them," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "They've never asked. They don't want to know." At that moment, Sarah appeared beside them, breathless from dancing. She glanced between James and Laura, sensing the tension. "Laura, there you are. Are you having fun?" she asked, unaware of the gravity of the conversation. "I see you've met my husband." James opened his mouth but hesitated, his discomfort palpable. "It's nice to meet you officially," he said, trying to smooth over the tension. But Laura could see the confusion in his eyes. "Congratulations on your marriage," she said, offering a polite smile. "You too, ma'am," James said, his voice stiff. Before the situation could escalate, Aunt Carol, slightly tipsy from champagne, joined them, oblivious to the undercurrents of the conversation. "Sarah, dear, you should introduce your husband to more of the family. Laura, honey, why don't you tell Jim about your job? I'm sure he'd find it interesting to hear about the administrative side of the Navy." The words hung in the air, as if the room had collectively held its breath. Laura's heart sank again, her patience thinning. She glanced at James, who was now visibly bristling. "Actually, Mrs. Patterson," James began, his voice colder than before, "I'd be very interested to hear about Commander Morgan's job." "Laura," he added, catching himself quickly. "I mean Laura's job." Aunt Carol's words hung in the air like a heavy mist. Laura could feel the collective gaze of the room turn toward her. She had spent a lifetime avoiding this exact moment, facing her family's misconceptions head-on. Now, as her father and relatives exchanged glances, the weight of the truth felt unbearable. James, sensing the tension, squared his shoulders. "Mrs. Patterson," he said carefully, his voice taking on a formal tone, "with all due respect, I don't think you understand the full extent of Laura's role in the Navy. She's not just some clerk at a desk." His eyes met Laura's, searching for her approval, but there was something in his gaze, a quiet plea for justice. Aunt Carol scoffed, brushing off his words. "Well, I'm sure she's doing something important," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "But she never made it as an actual officer, did she?" Laura's hand tightened around the edge of her glass. Her father had once said those same words, those exact words. "You never made it as an officer." It had been his mantra, a phrase he repeated like a punishment she couldn't escape, even long after she had far surpassed his expectations. Jim's jaw clenched, his gaze shifting to Bob. "Actually," he said, his voice sharper now, "Laura didn't just make it as an officer. She's the commanding officer of USS Hartford, one of the most advanced nuclear attack submarines in the fleet." The room went quiet. Every face turned toward Jim. Aunt Carol's expression faltered for a second, her mouth hanging open as if the words had knocked the breath out of her. Laura could feel her father's eyes on her, a flicker of confusion clouding his features. For a moment the world seemed to stop. It was as though time had stretched, and the reality of what Jim had just said was settling into the air around them. "Commander Morgan," Jim continued, his voice resonating with pride, "has served with distinction for over 20 years. She commands a crew of 135 sailors, and her leadership has earned her the respect of everyone she works with. She's received multiple awards, including the Bronze Star and a Navy Commendation Medal. She is, without a doubt, one of the most capable officers I've ever worked with." The words hit like a series of sharp punches, each one cutting through the facade that had long been built around her. Laura's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a revelation, it was a reckoning. For years, her accomplishments had been dismissed, swept aside in favor of assumptions that never aligned with reality. And now, here they were, forced to see her for who she truly was. Aunt Carol blinked, clearly flustered. But I thought," she stammered. "You said she couldn't handle the pressure." She turned to Bob, the confusion clear on her face. Bob, still standing at the head table, had turned pale. His jaw clenched as he processed what Jim had just said. Laura could see the wheels turning in his mind, but for the first time in years, she didn't think he was simply trying to explain away his own shortcomings. He looked unsure, conflicted. "Laura," Aunt Patricia began hesitantly, "you never told us this." There was a tremor in her voice, a mixture of surprise and guilt. "I never told you," Laura said, her voice steady but low. "Because every time I tried, I was told it didn't matter. I was told I was just playing at being a part of the Navy, not actually doing something real." The room had gone completely still, the noise from the reception fading into the background. All eyes were now on Laura. The silence that followed felt heavy, thick with years of unspoken words. Her father finally spoke, his voice cracking with uncertainty. "Laura, he paused, swallowing hard. I never meant, he trailed off, his gaze faltering. I thought I was protecting you, he said in a whisper, almost to himself. I thought you'd be disappointed, that you wouldn't be able to handle the pressure. I was wrong. Maybe you were, Laura replied quietly, her gaze never leaving his. But you didn't just protect me. You kept me in a box, Dad. You decided what I could handle, what I could achieve, and you never questioned it. Her voice was calm, but the pain that had festered for so long cut through her words like a knife. James stepped forward then, his voice unwavering. Sir, with all due respect, your daughter is a commanding officer of a nuclear submarine. That's no small feat, and what she's done for this country is immeasurable. His eyes met Laura's again, a silent understanding passing between them. She's one of the most respected officers in the fleet. She's saved lives, led operations, and kept us safe. And for years, she's been carrying the weight of your assumptions about her. No one else sees her that way, but you've let that belief shape your view of her. Laura could see the change in her father's face. The hardness in his eyes was slowly melting away, replaced by something like regret. I didn't know, he said softly, almost as if the words were foreign to him. I never knew. Aunt Carol, her face flushed with embarrassment, stood up. Laura, she said, her voice cracking. I didn't know. I'm so sorry. The apology was jarring, and for a moment, Laura didn't know how to respond. But the tears in Aunt Carol's eyes told her everything she needed to know. As the moments dragged on, the reception hall seemed to hold its breath. The guests had finally realized what was happening. Whispers spread like wildfire, and though the atmosphere had shifted, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that something deep inside her had broken free. It wasn't just her father's perception that had been shattered, it was the family's collective vision of her. And in that moment, Laura realized that while she had never needed their approval, it felt different to finally be seen for who she truly was. Laura, I had no idea, her father said, his voice shaking. He looked lost, as though the ground beneath him had shifted, and he wasn't sure how to stand anymore. Laura's eyes softened, but the edges of her words were sharp. You never asked. All these years you never asked. You assumed, and I never fought back because I thought maybe it wasn't worth the fight. But I'm not the person you thought I was. And I never will be. The weight of her words lingered in the air, and for the first time, she saw her father grapple with the reality of what he had missed. I thought I was doing what was best, he said, almost pleading. I know you did, Laura replied, her voice steady. But you kept me in the shadows, Dad. You didn't want to see me for who I really am. And that hurt more than anything else. For a moment there was only silence. Then her father, his voice trembling, asked, Can you forgive me? Laura took a deep breath. I forgave you a long time ago, she said quietly. But the question is whether you can forgive yourself. The rest of the evening passed in a haze for Laura. As the reception slowly wound down, she found herself at the center of quiet, tentative conversations. People came up to her, offering congratulations, asking questions about her service, and sharing their newfound respect for her. It wasn't the vindication she had longed for, but it was something more, an acknowledgement long overdue. Later, after most of the guests had left, James came up to her once more. He was smiling now, though there was a tinge of embarrassment in his eyes. Ma'am, he said, I want to apologize for overstepping earlier. He stopped himself, shaking his head. I thought someone needed to say the truth. Laura smiled at him, feeling a warmth spread inside her. You did the right thing, Jim, she said quietly. Thank you. The moment lingered before she spoke again. And congratulations on your marriage. I hope you and Sarah find everything you're looking for. Thank you, ma'am, Jim said, his voice sincere. It's been an honor to serve with you, and if I may, if you'll have us, Sarah and I would love to attend your promotion ceremony next month. Laura's eyes softened. I'd like that. I'd like that very much. As the night came to a close, Laura drove home, her thoughts swirling. For 22 years, she had carried the burden of her family's assumptions, their casual dismissal of her achievements. But tonight something had shifted. She hadn't needed their approval to succeed, but it felt good to finally be seen clearly. As she sat in the silence of her car, she realized that sometimes the most profound revenge wasn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was simply the quiet satisfaction of being exactly who you had always been, while everyone else finally caught up to the truth.